If you haven't heard about Anchor, it is the easiest way to make a podcast. Please, let me explain. 1, it is free. 2, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from the phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many, many others. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It is everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So please, download the free Anchor app and go to anchor.fm and get started today.
The Ear, Evangelical and Reformed Christian Podcast. Welcome to The Ear, the Evangelical and Reformed, a Christian podcast that urges you to think deeper and draws you closer to God through faith. Through powerful sermons, teaching segments, and discussions, The Ear hopes to give you a different perspective on secular topics from a Christian worldview. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Please welcome your host, Brandon Queen.
Good morning, podcast world, and welcome back to a late episode of The Ear. And we're going to be moving everything down to Saturdays now due to my new job, with my real job, if you will. And today we're going to talk about a Bible character that I've never, ever heard of. And I'm pretty well knowledgeable when it comes to the Bible, but I've never heard of this person. And I'm going to try to pronounce the name. I don't know. Anyway, welcome back to the podcast, Matthew Everhard, the author of the book Unknown, which is entitled with this series. So, Matt, is it onymous or anonymous? Anonymous?
Well, you know what, Brandon? I'm glad you asked because I myself went online today and I listened to Max McLean read the ESV to me to make sure I was getting it right. And I'm going to go with Onesimus today as the proper pronunciation. Onesimus. But we could probably come up with all kinds of ways to mess up that name. We could call him Onesimus or Onesimus or anything else. I'm sure it'll all work. But Onesimus is the way Max McLean says it, so that's got to be right because he's smart.
Okay. Well, I've never heard of this character, and I've been reading the Bible my whole life. I don't know what happened, but I've never heard of this person. Can you tell us?
Yeah, well,
who he
probably
is?
Probably a lot of people haven't.
Okay, who is he?
Okay, well, that's a great question. So let's go to the tiny little book in our New Testament called Philemon, and the book is so short that we could almost read the whole thing out loud just to give the reader a glimpse, but I'll tell the story very quickly. Paul writes a letter to an early Christian named Philemon, and Philemon is the guy after whom the book Philemon is named, obviously. And what we know about Philemon is that he was an early church Christian and that there was a congregation that met in his home, as most of the Christian congregations did in those days. Paul met Philemon probably during his missionary journeys, and Philemon is associated with the church of Colossae, about which we have the letter Colossians in the New Testament. So what happens, Brandon, is that Philemon has a servant or a slave. In those days, slavery was a little different than the slavery that we think about in our nation's terrible history of slavery. But either way, Onesimus, his servant, escapes from his servitude under Philemon, and somehow Onesimus meets the Apostle Paul while he's in prison in Rome, which is told in Acts 27 and 28. And this runaway slave somehow forms a relationship with Paul, a friendship. Paul shares the gospel with Onesimus. Onesimus is converted to Christ, and then Paul decides that he's going to send Onesimus, the runaway slave, back to his master Philemon.
I remember.
And so we have this really interesting triangle of relationships between Paul and Philemon, Philemon and Onesimus and Paul. Neat story.
It is, and it's funny because when you started, telling the story, I'm like, okay, wait, I do remember this story. I just don't remember the names. But yes, I do remember the story. But goodness,
Yep.
Onesimus or Onesimus. Okay.
Yep.
So, Matt, whenever we read in the book of Philemon, and you have more study in this than I do, but there's there's a phrase that Paul uses. It's a persuasive rhetoric called arm twisting. And that was to convince Philemon to receive Onesimus back, if you will. So what are some of his most effective arguments?
Well, it's all over the book of Philemon. In fact, it's just rich with arm-twisting type of language. And if the listener will give him or herself a couple of minutes to read through Philemon, you're going to see it. But it comes across really from the get-go. Paul starts off in verse 5, and he says, I hear about your love and the faith that you have. He's really just setting him up. Oh, Philemon, you're such a loving guy. And then in verse 8, he says, I could command you to do what I'm about to ask, but I'd really rather have you do this out of the goodness of your heart. And then he brings up the subject of the runaway servant, Onesimus. And the first thing Paul calls him is my child, Onesimus. It's just sort of a doting on, affectionate name. Onesimus has become my child. And then he says in verse 12, he says, I'm sending him back to you, and I'm sending my own very heart with him. And so you got to picture this here. This is really rich, that Onesimus, the servant, he's actually carrying the letter of Philemon with him. He's the guy that's delivering the letter to Philemon. And so imagine the look on Philemon's face when he hears a knock at the door one day, and it's Onesimus, his runaway slave. And Onesimus hands him a letter. Out of all things, it's from Paul. And Paul is just pouring it on with this language of, I really wish you would do this. And then in verse 17, if you consider me a partner in your ministry. Now, of course, Philemon is going to consider Paul his partner because Paul is like the main guy in the early church. And then, as if that isn't enough, Paul essentially says, you kind of owe this to me because you owe your very self to me. And Paul reminds Philemon that he's the one that brought the gospel to Philemon. And so Philemon is like the child of Paul's evangelism as well. And so by the time you read through this short letter, Philemon has no choice but to receive back Onesimus. And Paul says, don't receive him back like a slave, but receive him back like a brother, because this man has been converted to Christ. So Paul really lays it on pretty thick.
Nice. That's pretty cool. So why do you think Paul allowed Onesimus to carry the letters to Colossae himself? I mean, he's a runaway slave, for goodness sake.
Right, exactly. So that's Paul's trust in the reality of Onesimus's conversion. I mean, you can almost imagine a situation in which Paul, sets Onesimus back, heads him towards Philemon, and Onesimus chickens out and says, no, wait a second, I'm not going back to my master. What if he doesn't forgive me? What if he beats me up? What if he puts me in chains or sends me to the debtor's prison? Or, you can imagine a lot of scenarios where Onesimus would be terrified to go back to his former master. Now, again, slavery in the first century wasn't exactly as horrible as we imagine it here in this nation's terrible history of slavery, but it wasn't a day at the park either, okay? Nobody here would sign up for slavery in the ancient world, even though it was a little less, restrictive than it was in our nation's history. But you can imagine Onesimus kind of thinking, you know what? Maybe I'll bolt, man. Maybe I'll get out of here. Maybe I won't go back to Philemon. But Paul knows that the gospel has truly transformed Onesimus, truly transformed him. And so part of the reason why Paul sends Onesimus back to Philemon is because Onesimus himself, he's got to do the right thing. There's an implication in verse 18, I think it is, that it could be that when Onesimus bolted, he might have stolen from his master too, because Paul says in verse 18, if he has wronged you at all or owes you anything, charge that to my account. So it's almost as though Paul knows something here, that maybe Onesimus may have picked his master's pockets on the way out the door, and nevertheless, Paul sends Onesimus back to do the right thing and to restore whatever it is that Onesimus may have taken on the way out of Philemon's supervision.
That's an interesting story. Let me ask, if I stole a book from you, Matt, would you forgive me? I mean,
if you stole a book from me, yeah, I guess I can forgive you.
Yeah, but the dynamic though with Paul and Philemon is phenomenal. I mean, Paul is like saying, "Hey, charge this to my account." Like, who does that? Who writes off somebody else's wrongdoing? You know, it's a beautiful thing.
Exactly.
Now, have you ever met anyone whose entire life was transformed by encountering Jesus Christ? Now, you titled this particular chapter Onesimus, the man with a troubled past. And this question fits in perfectly. Like, have you ever met someone with a troubled past that was completely transformed by encountering Jesus Christ?
Oh, yeah. Lots of them, Brandon. Lots of them. Starting with me and you, right?
Yeah.
I mean, our lives were transformed by Christ. And who knows what we would be or what we might have done had we not met Christ. And I became a Christian when I was 12, so the Lord saved me before I made a big, huge mess out of my life. But I was a twisted up sinner before I met Jesus. So, the first person I think of is myself. But I know a lot of people that have some incredible testimonies. And in the book Unknown, I share a story about one of my good friends. He's a Presbyterian pastor today. His name's Chris, and he wouldn't mind me sharing his story because he shares it everywhere he goes. But Chris went to prison for drugs and all kinds of stuff when he was a young man, and he got converted to Christ in prison and was asked to preach the Bible study in the prison yard. So he preached his first sermon in the prison during their free time out in the yard. And when he got released, somebody gave him a bunch of books, and they weren't like self-help type Christian books. They were like solid theology, like John Calvin and Benjamin Warfield and all this kind of great stuff. Chris gobbled it up and started growing in his faith. Now you got to picture a guy who's got tattoos all up and down his arms, even some kind of violent-looking tattoos on his body. He's got those ear holes that you can see through. He's kind of a neat-looking dude. But he ended up becoming the custodian for the church that I worked at. So imagine this. You've got this guy who's gobbling up theology. He's the church custodian. He puts himself through seminary and then ultimately becomes an ordained Presbyterian pastor. So if you think about it, this dude went from prison to custodian to pastor. Now that's an awesome trajectory. That's leveling up, right? I mean,
have I met
what
this
a testimony
Chris?
of Christ's saving grace.
Yeah.
I don't know if you met him or not.
Huh. I mean, I have a weakness. I like tattoos. I just won't get one. If I can be honest. Yeah, but that's awesome. I mean, and everybody would look at a person like Chris and say, oh, bunch of tattoos, ear holes. He don't believe in God. We'll just throw him off to the side, But
yeah,
instead of, taking that person and sitting them down and talking to them and learning their past. I mean, my pastor is an alcoholic. All right. When I say alcoholic, he's obviously not actively drinking right now. But in his younger days, he was an alcoholic. He, functioned off of alcohol. But look at him today. He's preaching the gospel. And I love seeing people like my pastor and Chris and other people that don't fit the normal bill of what a pastor should look like. However, they are that very thing God's called them to be. So that's awesome.
That's right.
I love how God will use somebody's past to, to make